Acha.
This is my pleasure to introduce Shakuntala Chatterjee, Dr. Shakuntala Chatterjee from SN Bose National Center for Basic Sciences. So the talk, the title is Effect of Receptor Clustering on Chemotactic Performance of E. coli, Sensing versus Adaptation. So Shakuntala.
Okay, so I begin by thanking the organizers for this opportunity to speak here, and also for organizing this very stimulating meeting in this difficult
You may want to realign your camera, Shakuntala, because part of your head only visible. No, your screen is perfectly visible. Yeah.
This is okay?
Yeah, this is better.
Acha. So I wanted to thank the organizers for organizing this meeting in this difficult and non-ideal situation. So the title of my talk is Effect of Receptor Clustering on Chemotactic Performance of E. coli, Sensing versus Adaptation. The work that I will present here was mostly done with Shobhan Dev Mondol, who is a PhD student at SN Bose Center, and this is part of his thesis work. Some of the earlier results, which I will not talk about at great detail in this talk, was obtained by Shubroto Dev, who was a former student, and right now he is doing a postdoc in Paris. Now, we know that how a cell is going to behave is controlled by the intracellular reaction network. A cell receives an input signal, processes the signal through its intracellular signaling network, and finally responds to it. So all the proteins which are inside the cell, which are taking part in these intracellular reactions, they can have fluctuations in their concentration, and definitely that is going to affect the reaction output. So the general question that people ask in this field is how this pathway noise affects the cell response. Particularly since the time when single cell experiments have been possible, people are actually seeing these noises in experiment, and then this question becomes more relevant, that how, because of these intracellular fluctuations, the behavior of a cell, the response of a cell is going to get affected. And in this talk, I will address this question within the framework of E. coli chemotaxis, which is one of the best characterized systems in biology. What is chemotaxis? It is the ability of the cell to move in a chemical environment. So this is a cartoon picture. This is an E. coli bacteria, and if you put it in a concentration gradient of chemoattractant, then it moves towards a region where there is larger concentration of chemoattractant present. Similarly, if it experiences a gradient of chemorepellent, then it would like to move in the opposite direction where the concentration of repellent is low. And this motion, yes.
Just to interrupt you for a minute, can you bring down your screen of your laptop a little bit lower so that we can see your face?
Oh, achha, you can't see my face. Is this okay?
Yeah, now it is perfect.
Achha, thank you. Okay, so hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Good. So I'm sorry, I'm asking again and again, can you hear me? Because yesterday in some talk, I tried to ask questions, and then I realized my microphone was not working. Okay. So that's why I'm asking. I think since morning I asked about 10 times, can you hear me? So anyway, so this is the phenomena of chemotaxis. Now this motion of this E. coli bacteria takes place using run and tumble motility. So what is that? The typical size of this E. coli cell is about 2 to 3 micron. And then each cell has some 10 to 12 flagella associated with it, and each flagella is connected to the cell body via some flagellar motors. Now, when all the motors rotate in the counterclockwise direction, then the flagella form a helical bundle as shown here, and this gives a propelling force to the cell, and the cell swims smoothly. This is called a run. This is a directional motion of the cell, and the typical run speed for E. coli is about 20 micron per second. On the other hand, when some of the flagellar motors rotate in the clockwise direction, then this helical bundle gets dispersed. So the flagella are now throwing up in all the directions. There is no net force and the cell tumbles. A tumble means the cell just randomly rotates about its own body axis without any net displacement. And this tumble also offers the cell an opportunity to choose a new direction for the next run. Typical run duration is of the order of 1 second and typical tumble duration is of the order of 0.2 seconds. Now, because the size of the E. coli cell is very small, about 2 to 3 micron, it cannot sense the spatial gradient directly. There are other eukaryotic organisms which are longer, let's say 10 to 12 microns. They can actually compare the chemical concentration between their nose and tail, and this way they decide which way the gradient is increasing, which way the gradient is directed. However, E. coli is very small, only a couple of microns long, so this comparison is not feasible. So it relies on temporal integration, meaning it moves, and as it moves, it remembers the chemical environment along its trajectory and navigates its motion based on that information. Suppose if it finds that along its trajectory, food concentration is going up, that means it is headed towards a good region, then it keeps running in that direction. On the other hand, if it finds that the food concentration is going down along its trajectory, it tends to quickly tumble and choose a new direction to run. So therefore, runs are elongated in the favorable direction and shortened in the opposite direction. And this gives rise to a net chemotactic drift. So in this picture, in the left panel, the cell has been placed in an homogeneous nutrient environment. And you see its run tumble motion, and at the end of large number of run and tumble, there is not much net displacement of the cell. It came back roughly where it was. On the other hand, the right panel shows a gradient of chemotaxis, a gradient of chemoattractant, and which is actually increasing downward. It is color coded. And now you see, although the bacteria is sometimes running in the opposite direction, but those runs are typically shortened, and the runs which are directed downward or has a component downward, they are elongated, and as a result, the bacteria shows some net displacement. This is called the chemotactic drift. This is a cartoon of the intracellular network. So let me briefly go through that. This is the chemoreceptor. These are transmembrane chemoreceptor, and a chemoreceptor can be in two states, active or inactive. When it is active, then when it is not bound to any ligand molecules, then it is in the active state. In the active state, it causes phosphorylation of this cytoplasmic protein key A, and this protein in turn gives its phosphate group to two proteins, key Y and key B. Key Y takes up the phosphate group, becomes key YP, and in this phosphorylated form, it binds to the flagellar motors and increases their clockwise bias. So the cell tumbles. On the other hand, if there is some ligand connected to the chemoreceptor, then it is in the inactive state. Then this phosphorylation is not possible. So key Y does not get any phosphate, key YP cannot get formed, then the cell swims smoothly. This is the sensing part of the network. There is another module which is the adaptation module. That goes like this. The phosphate group also goes to this other protein key B. This key B becomes key BP, and in this phosphorylated form, this demethylates the chemoreceptor. However, when it demethylates the chemoreceptor, its activity goes down. And then this key AP cannot get formed, demethylation in turn stops, and then the methylation level of the chemoreceptor keeps going up under the action of this other methylating enzyme key R. So this works like a negative feedback. This is responsible for adaptation in the cell. So there are mainly two modules in this chemotactic network. One is sensing, another is adaptation. in absence of any noise in the biochemical pathway, one would expect that the switching between the run mode and tumble mode, these are Poisson process. That means that the run duration and tumble durations have exponential distribution. However, for the first time, when the single cell measurement was actually possible for an E. coli, this group had shown that run durations actually have a power law distribution, not an exponential, but a power law. This is the experimental data. Now, then it was argued that large fluctuations in the CCW, counterclockwise lifetime, makes long runs possible. That's why runs do not decay exponentially, but more slowly as a power law. Now, however, it was also established that this noise that is present at the single cell level actually does not impair the population level chemotactic ability. This was shown by a series of work. I have just listed few here. By no means this is exhaustive. And in fact, in a more recent work, which was published in eLife in 2014, they had argued that this noise is actually beneficial at the population level, because if you have a population with a large variability, different members of the population behaves in a different way. And if you place such a colony in a generic nutrient environment, then each type of behavior may be suitable for a specific type of environment. So when the nutrient environment is uncertain, as often in the physical situation, then these people have argued that this variability in the population is actually beneficial. The question is, what is the effect on the single cell response? So far, it was all at the population level, but what is the effect of noise on the response of a single cell? To answer that question, first we have to realize what is the most important source of noise in this biochemical network. It turns out the most important source of noise is methylation. Why? Because the methylation-demethylation reactions are extremely slow. The typical reaction rates are like 0.01 second inverse, which is order of magnitude slower than all other reactions which are taking place in the network. This means that if any fluctuation is present at this level, it acts as a slow noise. You cannot average it out easily in the downstream processes. Also, fluctuations are particularly present here because of the very low abundance of the enzymes KIR and KIB. In fact, in an E. coli cell, there is about 140 molecules of KIR enzymes present, and KIB enzyme is slightly more than that, about 240. So because of these very low concentrations, these are prone to fluctuations, and these fluctuations give rise to a slow noise at the methylation level. So for a long time, people believed that this methylation is the most important source of noise. And in fact, in this work in 2012, this group had shown that this noise actually enhances the chemotactic drift. Normally, you would expect noise should be bad for sensing, but they had shown that in a theoretical model, that the noise actually enhances the chemotactic drift. And they argued it by saying that drift motion is mainly controlled by the long runs, and the long runs are more and more probable as you increase the noise, because now you have a power law distribution for large noise. So they have argued that this is why noise actually enhances the chemotactic drift. However, we had shown in a subsequent work with Subroto Dev that this is not the complete story. I do not want to talk about this work today in this talk. If somebody is interested, we can discuss it later. Very briefly, I just want to mention our main finding, that we had to do a detailed analysis of this KYP level, the protein that is responsible for tumbling, the KYP level statistics. And what we had found, there is a threshold concentration of KYP below which the behavior of the cell is detrimental to chemotaxis. And that is, the cell tends to move towards a region where there is less food, only below a certain threshold concentration. And that threshold value actually depends on noise. As you increase noise, then the threshold keeps getting lower and lower. And these two are responsible for observing this noise-induced enhancement of chemotactic drift. But I don't want to spend any more time on this. Today I wanted to talk about some other work that we have done after that. So there was this experiment which was published in eLife in 2018, very recently, and they had shown that even in absence of methylation, they are recording fluctuation. So they had measured the activity of the receptors directly using some freight measurement. And the left panel is the data for methylation deficient cell where you don't have these KRKB enzymes. And this is the power spectrum. And it shows this black line, look at the black line, it shows there is significant amount of noise present. And that is actually comparable to another cell where this methylation, demethylation is actually happening. The red line shows the case when the receptor clustering is disrupted. They had shown that when you disrupt the receptor clustering, I will come in a moment, what do I mean by receptor clustering? When you disrupt the receptor clustering, then the fluctuations are gone. But even when you take away methylation, there are still fluctuations present. So what do I mean by receptor clustering? There are few thousand receptors in a cell and they form homodimers, and then 3 homodimers form a trimer of dimer. And then many such trimer of dimers tend to form cluster or signaling teams. So in this picture, these blobs are, spheres are showing trimer of dimers, and each dotted line shows a cluster boundary, or within each dotted line there is a signaling team. And all the receptors in a team switch their activity in a synchronous way. So they become active to inactive simultaneously. For example, here in this picture, I have 2 colors, red and blue, for active and inactive. And as you can see, all the receptors in a given cluster are in the same state of activity. This results in amplification of the input signal that comes from ligand binding. Because now I don't have one receptor, I have a large number of receptors, all of them flipping their activity together. This results in amplification of the signal, and this is responsible for very sensitivity that the E. coli bacteria shows even when you put it in a weak concentration gradient. This receptor cooperativity results in signal amplification. However, when you have larger clusters, that also means the number of signaling teams are small because the number of receptors is fixed. So when you have large teams, the number of teams will be small. Therefore, when you are measuring the total activity of the cell, which is the sum of activity of all the individual signaling teams, that sum is now being performed over a smaller number of teams. This results in large fluctuations in the total activity.
I have a question. This receptor clustering, I mean, this receptor time. So these are membrane receptors, correct?
That's right.
So they are not always in the same location of them. How do they cluster, or are they before making the signaling team?
Okay, most of the receptors are actually in the polar region where the membrane curvature is large. In most of the receptors, first of all, these clusters can also be dynamic. Okay. Sometimes they are forming, sometimes they are breaking up. They can also be dynamic, and also most receptors are actually in this part of the membrane where it is, I mean, not all of them are clustered together, but they show a clustering tendency, a cooperativity.
I see.
And also the large clusters are mainly in the polar part of the membrane. So go back to this. In this, I mean, in this region of the membrane where the curvature is large, most receptors are here.
So these are, so in your, go back to the that picture where you are showing this clustering. So you have these 2 color clusters. So I mean, but those are same receptor forming different clusters, or these are 2 different classes of receptors?
No, this is like to take it as a snapshot. These are different clusters. Okay, there are many receptors. They are breaking up into teams, and
So
each
that's the
team.
question. So in a cluster, there are various classes of receptor in a given cluster, or just a single class of receptor?
Oh, acha. You mean mixed receptors? Yeah, I understand. I think there are mixed receptors also. Not only the same, exactly the same. There are mixed receptors also which are taking part in clusters.
Because that.
So Shakuntala, I think I'll amplify Prabal's question. So
Yes.
when you say that this is in blue and red, so the same receptor can flip its state from blue to red. That's what you mean?
Exactly. That is what that is what results in the amplification of the signal. They change their activity, but they do it in unison. If you are part of this cluster, you will do it along with the rest of the members in the cluster.
I see. No, so when you say that activity switched synchronous activity, because if it is a different classes of receptor in a given cluster, their activity will be triggered at different whatever.
That's right, Prabal. That's right. Yeah. I don't know this actually exactly. I think there were some evidence where people have found even mixed receptors show some clustering tendency. But I understand your point. You are saying that it will be different. Yeah.
So I was thinking that how do they synchronize the activity if there are different receptor or maybe similar. So that's the.
Yeah. Actually, in our work, we had considered only one type of receptor, but yeah, maybe mixed receptors do not cluster. I don't know this actually. Okay.
I have a question, Shakuntala. So these two colors, two different colors indicate different clusters, right? So
two different colors indicate different activity states.
Different activity states. Okay. Right. So your clustering is based on the activity state, right?
No.
So your the criteria of
clusters are there, and they switch. They are like a team. They switch their activity in unison.
Okay. So, no. So thing is that are you identifying the clusters, or are you assuming that the clusters are already present in some form, and based on that you are going ahead of the calculation?
Clusters have been experimentally observed.
Okay.
They are already there, and then these clusters are changing their activity simultaneously. The clusters are already there. They are not identified because then there will be only two clusters: active cluster, inactive clusters. But there are, for example, all this blue can suddenly turn red without any other change in the
blue means active and red means inactive, something like that.
Yeah, something. Good. Any other question? Okay. So what we sure.
Question is there from Pranay, asking that can you elaborate how cluster boundaries are defined numerically? There is a question from Pranay.
Okay. So in experiment, what people see this receptor array, it has a hexagonal arrangement. It is spatially arranged in this way, and how actually cluster boundaries may not be very well defined, because sometimes people see some enzymes crossing over from one cluster to another. That is also seen. So, but the main point here is they show a clustering tendency. These cluster boundaries are also known to be dynamic. They can also change. Okay. So, okay. So the question that we are asking is how this newly found noise source affects the single cell chemotactic performance. So first I have to quantify what do I mean by performance. One is how fast the cell is able to climb up the gradient. That is its drift, the magnitude of the drift velocity. That can be one measure of performance. Second criteria could be how strongly it is able to localize in the nutrient-rich region. Third criteria could be, another way of saying this is the ability of the cell to distinguish between regions of high and low nutrient levels. So using these various perspective, we actually try to quantify the chemotactic performance. And what we find that there is an optimum size of the receptor cluster for the best chemotactic performance. So very briefly, I will just tell you few words about my model. I am not going to give all the model details here. So as I had said, chemoreceptors form trimers of dimers. And then between the active and inactive state, one can write down the free energy. And this free energy looks like this. Here X is the position of the cell. Cx is the nutrient concentration at that position. Mi is the ith receptor dimer in that cluster, the methylation level of the ith receptor dimer in that cluster. And this formula was given, this is called MWC model. It was given by these people and it has been widely used in the literature to calculate the free energy difference between active and inactive state. And as I said, all receptors within a cluster switch their activity state simultaneously, and that switching rate depends on this free energy. Just two other aspects I want to mention before I present my results. That is the we have already said that the number of enzyme molecules.
Can you go back to that free energy expression just to understand it? So,
yes.
So what is this K mean and K max? What are
right?
exactly?
Yeah. So these K mean and K max are parameters which actually sets the range of sensitivity. So the bacteria can sense any concentration between these two values, K mean and K max. Their typical values are, I think for a TAR receptor, the values we had used, the values are, the minimum level is about 18 micromolar and the maximum level is about 3 millimolar. So within this range, the bacteria can sense the concentration, but beyond this range, it cannot.
I see, but how, I mean, so this one, I mean, they empirically, I mean,
these are experimentally determined.
So experimentally, they determine the free energy difference between active and inactive states, and they feed this such empirical form to give you values of K mean, K max. Is that what they do? How do they fix these values of?
No, by K. I think they test. I don't know actually. I think they test the below which
concentration gradient they will measure in experiment, correct?
But you can also experimentally measure that till what level you can actually increase your concentration level and then the response will saturate. That may set Kmax.
They will do control experiment by changing this to get this value of K mean, K max.
Right.
Can I comment here? See, this was, to my knowledge, this was done in the context of allostery of the enzymes.
That's right.
And there they actually had a derivation of this formula. And there are two competing formula. One was, of course, MWC. The other was, I forget the name of the two gentlemen who gave another formula. So these were the context of enzymatic reactions. And there, you know, this K mean, K max have some interpretation. So this was formulated in this particular way. And then, of course, you can fit and get the values of K mean, K max from experiment if one wishes. Yeah, so it has a sort of long history. But so this was not just a fit formula. It was sort of microscopic model from which they were derived. Yeah.
I see. Okay.
Okay. So what we have discussed is the number of enzyme molecules are only of the order of few hundred, but there are few thousand receptors in the cell, which means for a receptor dimer to find an free enzyme molecule in the cell cytoplasm, bind to it and modify its methylation level, it takes a very long time. So then the question is how to reconcile the low abundance with perfect adaptation. For that, people had proposed mainly two mechanisms, assistance neighborhood and brachiation. In assistance neighborhood, it says that a bound enzyme can modify the methylation level of the neighboring dimers as well. And for brachiation, it means that a bound enzyme can perform a random walk on the receptor array before it unbinds and returns to the cell cytoplasm. Both these mechanisms mean that the from one binding event, multiple receptors can get their methylation level modified. And in our model, we include a flavor of these mechanisms. this is the result. First, we find a peak in localization and drift velocity. So we use a linear concentration profile of the nutrient.
Kuntala, what is the model? I just want to get a feeling. What exactly the model? Maybe I have missed somewhere you have mentioned.
Yeah, so we have these receptor dimers. They are in cluster. You calculate the cluster free energy from this, and then you have these KR, KB enzymes, which are actually present in the cell. They bind and unbind with the dimers with a certain rate, and then we are also allowing multiple, and from a single binding event, we are also allowing rebinding before it unbinds and return to the cell cytoplasm. That way we include the essence of these mechanisms within our model. And then we just calculate the activity and then the run-tumble probability from there. Okay, the model details I don't have here. I mean, you can look at the, so. But the model that we use are standard model in literature. In fact, it was motivated by this paper. The model was, I think, first, they used this model here. We have modified it slightly, but essentially used their parameter values and everything. Okay. So we have a linear concentration profile of the nutrient, and then the distribution of the cell position px is almost linear. And then the steepness of that distribution can give you one measure of the performance. If px increases steeply, that would mean that it has a strong probability to be where there is large nutrient concentration. So here we plot the steepness of px as a function of cluster size, and you see we find a peak. The lower panel shows the chemotactic drift velocity. There are two ways to measure the drift velocity in this case. One is by measuring the net displacement in a run and divide by the main run duration, or you can simply measure net displacement of the cell within a certain time interval and then divide it by the time interval. So both these drift velocities, they give me peak at a specific value of the cluster size. Another measure of the performance could be the differential behavior of the cell when the nutrient level in its environment goes up or down. Imagine a cell which is showing an uphill run, running uphill. Then you would expect that run should get longer, so it should be long time till it tumbles again. On the other hand, for a downhill run, you would expect it to tumble quickly. So what we do, we measure the time till the first tumble during an uphill run and downhill run and plot the difference between them, tau r minus tau l. R and L are right and left. And you see this difference also shows a peak at a specific cluster size. Interestingly, you can also use this idea for a tethered cell. For a tethered cell, there is no run and tumble motility, just one flagella is tethered. It's a tethered assay. But what you can do, you can ramp up or ramp down the nutrient level in its neighborhood, and you measure the transition to the clockwise rotation mode. And to compare it with the swimming cell data, we have also changed the nutrient level, the ramp rate. We have chosen it the same rate as that experienced by the swimming cell during a run. And you see, even for a tethered cell, this time difference, tau up minus tau down, shows a peak. So this is how to explain this peak. So we find that this peak results, performance peak results from a competition between sensing and adaptation. Activity, so let me just go over this argument. Remember, activity controls the tumbling rate. If activity is high, tumbling rate is high. If activity is low, tumbling rate is low. The activity, which is defined as the probability to find a receptor clustered in an active state, is given by this thing. This FL minus FM is the total free energy. FL is the ligand part of the free energy. FM is the methylation part of the free energy. Now, as we have seen that the ligand part is actually proportional to N, proportional to the cluster size, because remember this formula that we have here, this N is right here. So, as the cell moves uphill or downhill, its ligand free energy change in its ligand free energy is proportional to n. So as n increases, the change is larger, and then the activity also changes, much more when n is increasing. And this means that uphill runs are greatly extended, downhill runs are greatly shortened, which improves the performance. On the other hand, when n is increasing, activity fluctuations also increase. And this is where adaptation steps in. Because when the activity gets too high or too low, because of the negative feedback that is present in this adaptation module, it tries to restore the activity to its adapted value. And now the variation in the cluster free energy is controlled by FM. Now when the activity gets too low, in order to pull it up, there's a lot of methylation that needs to take place. So now change in FM overrides the change in FL. And as a result, the variation in cluster free energy is controlled by FM, and the cell is less sensitive to FL, less sensitive to ligand density. So now it may be possible that an uphill run is short and a downhill run gets longer. Such probabilities become increasingly likely, and this brings down the performance. So here I have plotted a typical time series of a cluster of size 200. It's a large cluster. And here I have the time series it switches between active and inactive states. And you see between 1 and 0, active and inactive. This is the time series for the corresponding methylation energy. Inactive clusters get methylated and active clusters get demethylated. So, and you can actually check that it actually follows this activity, active-inactive transitions. Methylation decreasing means demethylation, and when it is increasing, it's methylation. This is the time series for the ligand free energy. It tells you the run tumble trajectory of the cell. When ligand free energy is increasing, it's an uphill run. When it is decreasing, it's a downhill run, and when it is constant, it is a tumble phase. But notice the range of variation. The range of variation of ligand free energy is negligible compared to the large range of variation of FM. So now the variation is mainly controlled by FM. And in this fourth panel, I have plotted the probability to find a negative displacement of the cell. So what we do here, just observe the cell for a certain time interval t and calculate the probability that the net displacement in the time interval is negative. And you can see this probability decreases, reaches a minimum at a certain value of the cluster size, which is like the best performance. And then for large n, it increases again. For large n, when it is controlled by methylation, it increases again. These were the typical time series. At least these three plots were the typical time series. Here I have plotted the average change. This makes the point more clear. So average change in the free energy, ligand and methylation free energy during first few steps of an uphill run. Okay, and here, as you can see, when cluster sizes are small, like 10 or 20, then the change in methylation free energy is much smaller compared to the change in ligand free energy. When cluster size increases, they start becoming comparable. And when cluster size is large, then methylation free energy changes much more than the ligand free energy change. So what we have shown here is a competition between sensing module and adaptation module can give rise to a performance peak. I have neglected certain details in my model. One is, as I mentioned, the hexagonal geometry of the receptor array. I have not considered any spatial arrangement of the receptor array. So I have neglected that aspect. And another crucial aspect we have not considered is the membrane curvature energy. When the receptor clusters form, they also cause curvature in the membrane, and that has an energy cost. So that we have not considered in our model. And this is an important effect, and this will mean that the exact quantitative comparison between our results and experiment may not be possible, for which n value we are finding the peak that may not actually match, because large clusters are actually energetically not favorable because of this membrane curvature energy, very large clusters. But however, the main point that we are making, that the interplay between ligand free energy and methylation free energy can still be investigated experimentally as the receptor cooperativity is varied. These are two references where experiments were performed where they had shown for a tethered cell a stronger cooperativity of the receptors are experimentally shown to induce large activity fluctuations in a tethered cell. Now, within the same experimental setup, it should be possible to check if the variation of methylation free energy also increases when the receptor cooperativity is stronger. And finally, what is the effect on this chemotactic efficiency, this quantity that we had defined for a tethered cell. Most experiments are actually done on a tethered cell, so our observation for tethered cell may be experimentally most relevant. And finally, this is a more general statement that there is a wide variety of biological systems where you have sensing and adaptation, these type of modules. And it is a general question that one can look at, that whether in what type of system such a competition can actually result in a performance peak. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention and wait for questions.
Thank you, Shakuntala. So I invite other people to ask questions if they have.
There is one in chat box.
Oh yeah, right.
Okay.
I have a question. Can I ask this question?
Yes, sure.
See, when you mentioned this MWC model, there was an extension of that by Duke and Dennis Bray, Tom Duke and Dennis Bray, called conformational spread model. And the conformational spread model is based on something like, Ising-like description. So you also have a two-state, active and inactive. That's what they had. And they also had cooperativity, which is like the interaction between them, which tends to form the clusters. So it seems that maybe, the model that you have is somehow, it can be mapped onto their model, and the rest of the results may be hidden in some way in some of their works, maybe not exactly the way that you want for your problem. It may be worth comparing with the conformational spread model of Bray and Duke.
Yeah, I know about this Ising mapping that they use, that upspin, downspin, this way they use it. And they use this Ising cooperativity, that this ferromagnetic interaction, which means that the neighboring spins are aligned. And that is how they define it. I know about this model. But as far as I know, that this result of activity fluctuation and how this result of this new noise source and how it affects the cell performance, those things are not looked at. In fact,
no, I agree. They probably did not look at that. What I'm saying, that, in the Ising-like description, so this kind of noise, and then how that affects the performance. Okay, so that of course is new. I'm not questioning that at all. So I'm just saying that the model that forms the basis of your calculation, it may be a reformulation in some way, because you are giving credit to somebody who in 2018 or so wrote a paper in PLOS. So if their model you have taken, maybe their model is some generalization of Bray-Duke model.
Okay.
Yeah, there was some more question in the chat box or no?
Yes. I don't know. Maybe there is a question from Basil and Aditya. Do you want to ask the questions yourself, or shall I ask? Basil? I can ask the question. Maybe you can continue with the follow-up. The question from Basil is that he says that he or she, I don't know, I might have missed this. How did they change the cooperativity strength in the experiment?
Achha, in the experiment, what they did, let me go back to this. So in the experiment, they actually used a different version of this protein key W. So that is responsible for joining one key A protein to multiple chemoreceptors. And they changed this KW protein, they chose another variety, and that actually disrupts the clustering. Okay. So now it does not allow key A to influence as many receptors. It is only able to influence only a smaller number of receptors. So the activity synchronization that is observed is now only among a smaller team.
Okay.
That is what they did in experiment. Yeah.
And there is another question from Auditro. He saying that I could not understand how ligand-free energy shows whether the bacteria is having run or tumble.
Oh, actually, I did not present all the details here. Just one second. You see, just a sec. You see this free energy that contains this CX, this ligand concentration, and then this free energy actually controls the switching rate of the activity of a cluster. The activity changes from 0 to 1 based on this F, and probability to find the receptor cluster in an active state is given by this exponential of FL minus FM. FL is the ligand free energy, and you can see it from here. Is ligand free energy is large, or in general if this free energy is large, then that would mean the activity should be small, and then the cluster should keep running. And on the other hand, if the free energy is small, then the activity should be large, and then the cluster would show because activity controls the tumbling rate. Okay.
So there is another question from Urbasi Nakul asking that can you explain the slow and long noise concept mentioned in the talk? Are these related to colored noise or something?
No, the slow noise, it means that if something has a very fast fluctuation, then you can expect that, suppose you are looking at a reaction chain, and then at some level there is some fluctuation. But if that is very fast, then you can average it out in the downstream processes. But if that is very slow, then this slow variation will continue to get reflected in the downstream processes. That's what I meant. That is the slow noise. It is difficult to get rid of a slow noise. And it is still, I mean, in this paper by this Flores et al. That I was talking about in 2012, they did not consider it colored noise. They considered it white noise only. I don't know what happens if you consider colored noise.
Okay, so those are the questions from chat box. So if anybody else wants to ask any other questions directly also, please do so. Okay. So I think if there are no more questions, then I would like to thank Shakuntala again for a
Thank
wonderful
you.